Welcome to AP U.S. History. This is Chapter 6, and we're going to be talking about what caused the American Revolution, either directly or indirectly. Most would count the beginning of this conflict to start in 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War, and then leading up to 1775. So we're going to take a look at things that eventually brought the Americans to a point where they didn't think that they could be a colony of Great Britain anymore. Was the American Revolution inevitable? People have different opinions. I think that it probably was, due to the fact that the colonists were looking for something different. They expected more than they got from their mother country. Prior to the Revolutionary War, you had a fairly large population of Americans, mostly who come from a British background. They had a better standard of living in the colonies. They consumed a large quantity of English goods, primarily because they didn't make too many finished goods in the colonies. Britain provided protection and stability. It seemed like a good working relationship. There was something called salutary neglect, which essentially began in 1713, and it gave the colonists a greater sense of independence. They allowed the colonies to rule themselves, basically. Not too much interference from the English crown or the Parliament. Between 1713 and 1763, there was very little intervention by the Great Britain's Parliament. Sir Robert Walpole was the fellow who came up with this idea. He believed that it would generate more income. They would have to spend less money if they just simply let the colonists rule themselves, have self-rule. So during this period of time, Great Britain was focused on major wars, which also explains why they didn't have such tight controls over the colonies. A lot of European wars. So they were pretty much left to train their own militia to protect themselves from the French and the Indians, and whomever might darken their door. This is a picture of Walpole and coming up with this salutary neglect. So the colonists developed self-government. There were 13 separate colonies that will emerge, and they will be under the authority of the English Parliament. By the time of the Revolutionary War, most of the colonies are royal colonies, and that is that the crown appointed the governor. The one thing that the colonies did have going for them is that they controlled the wages of the governor. So Americans were used to regulating their own affairs. American manufacturing increased despite the policies that protected British manufacturers. That is, that Americans couldn't buy from anyone else other than the English under this mercantile system. The navigation laws forbid them from buying goods from other countries. Of course, there was quite a bit of smuggling in the colonies because they didn't have to pay a tax, and usually the stuff that they got from other countries was cheaper than the things that they got from Great Britain. So the smuggling laws were pretty lax. And as a result of that, the colonists avoided paying taxes to the crown, which was considered a major crime, a capital crime if you were smuggling. Now, in terms of the history of rebellion in the colonies, of course, we go back to Bacon's Rebellion, one of the first. The Paxton Boys in 1764 weren't too happy with the lenient government policies towards the Indians. They weren't too crazy about the proclamation of 1763. They went on a killing spree and killed about 20 Native Americans, and then followed up on a march to Philadelphia. Ben Franklin said, "Boys, let's have a beer and talk about this," and he persuaded them not to go any further. The regulator movement in 1771, essentially North Carolinian farmers a little bit frustrated with the British government that they weren't being protected, inadequate representation, and the policies seemed to favor the wealthy plantation owners. And so they took it in their hands to set things right. And eventually this movement will die out in North Carolina. This shows the massacre of the Paxton Boys in 1763 and 64, essentially killing Indians as a payback, partly because of the Pontiac's rebellion and just a general hate for Native Americans. Of course, Ben Franklin persuaded the Paxton Boys to give up the struggle. In terms of fighting, you had minor skirmishes along the frontier with Indians. The frontiers people were really an independent lot. And they didn't take kindly to people telling them what to do. And of course, we talked about Bacon's Rebellion and Lesher's Rebellion. So there was a history of violence in the colonies. The mercantile system probably had something to do indirectly with the Revolutionary War. Basically, the British government saw the colonies existing for their benefit. The colonies would add wealth and prosperity to the British government. They would send their raw goods over and receive finished goods from Great Britain. So the colonies were there to benefit the government. One good thing that the British government did provide was protection for American ships, and there was a market for the goods that the colonists grew or harvested in the New World. So this mercantile system served both fairly well, but it did seem to favor the British Crown. Adam Smith, one of the first well-known economists, attacked the mercantile system and said that government should not be interfering with business, free trade, and he wasn't too popular with the Parliament or the British King. As far as mercantile is concerned, the British, one of the reasons that they could enforce this better than other nations is that they had a fairly large navy, and therefore they could patrol the seas. Although prior to 1763, the navigation laws were not as enforced as rigorously as after the war, primarily because some of the colonists were trading with the British or with the French during the French and Indian War, and the British government took a dim view of that. So the navigation laws, although they start in 1651 to try to stop the Dutch from trading with the colonies, it pretty much was a failure. Under the provisions, commerce to England or American vessels, enumerated articles like tobacco had to be shipped to England, and then they would be sold in Europe. All European products had to go through England first, and certain restrictions on colonial manufacturing existed because the English merchants didn't want competition. Molasses Act, 1733, put a heavy import tax on French molasses, so you would buy British molasses. The positive results of British mercantilism did not adversely affect the colonies until after 1763. Colonies had military protection on the high seas and in the frontier because of the British presence. And so both actually benefited from mercantilism. The negative impact of mercantilism, American manufacturing was hindered. The southern colonies suffered because they really only exported agricultural goods to England. And they could have received a higher price if they had shipped them to Europe. So the colonies were forced to pay higher prices on imported goods. There were something called writs of assistance, which were issued to stop smuggling. Essentially, English officials were given a blank check to search anyone's house or warehouse for smuggled goods, which in English law you needed to have a judge sign in order to show cause for searching your premises. 1761, there was a man named James Otis. He was a lawyer, and he demanded a repeal of this act, this writs of assistance. Otis built a reputation mainly on his famous challenge on the writs, but his complaints pretty much went unheeded. Salutary neglect. Because you had the freedom to do as you please for a number of years, and then all of a sudden, 1763, after that, they start tightening things up. There's going to be a certain amount of resentment. George Grenville, he was the new prime minister who replaced William Pitt. He wanted to enforce the navigation laws, and he wanted to try offenders in what they called admiralty courts, which essentially you were guilty until you could prove yourself innocent. There was no trial by peers. The British government is going to incur a lot of debts from the 7 Years' War, and they felt the colonies should pay their fair share. And so King George III will seek greater control over the colonies. And like most things, when people have had a taste of freedom, they don't want to go back to a situation where they have less freedoms. Grenville, not very popular in the colonies. Pitt had promised to pay the colonists for their participation in the French and Indian War. He goes back on that. The Currency Act was passed, which restricted colonies from printing their own money. They had to use silver or gold. The Quartering Act was passed in 1765, which said that the colonists should have to pay for the food and housing of British troops. Of course, the Sugar Act passed in 1764, again tried to regulate the triangular trade and put a heavy tax on molasses, and that went to the crown. In terms of the three great crises, we'll look at the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, and the Tea Act. And we'll stop right there.